March 29, 1945, Western Germany. Major General Maurice Rose sat forward in his jeep with a map on his knees and a stopwatch in his head. He commanded the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, Spearhead, and at this stage of the war he was operating like a man who had learned the last lesson of mechanized combat. Speed is mercy. Speed ends firefights before they start. Speed prevents the enemy from choosing where you bleed. Speed turns resistance into surrender. That morning, Rose had chosen a single road and built an entire gamble around it. Not because he loved roads, but because roads were the only thing that could keep an armored division coherent. Tanks could cross fields, trucks could not. Fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, recovery vehicles, engineers, medics, everything that kept armor alive, had to move on pavement. A division didn't advance on horsepower. It advanced on a narrow ribbon of logistics. His staff likely believed it was a clean calculation. The enemy was the Ruhr was collapsing, German fuel reserves were thin, Allied air power made daylight movement risky for the defenders. There was a straight line on the map that promised penetration. One road that could carry the bulk of the division forward, fast. The plan assumed the familiar thing every commander wants to believe, that the environment will behave normally for a few more hours, that the road will remain open, that refuel points will be reachable, that traffic will flow. Then the hidden variable arrived. It wasn't a Tiger tank. It wasn't a minefield. It wasn't even German artillery. It was something more humiliating and more lethal to a modern army. A delay in fuel distribution caused by a single choke point and the order in which vehicles were allowed to pass. In combat, fuel isn't a resource, it's a timer. When Rose bet everything on one road, he also bet on a system, the convoy schedule behind him, the traffic discipline, the refuel rhythm, the ability of his rear echelons to if any link in that chain lost tempo, the division would keep moving for a short while, then stop everywhere at once, like a body whose blood pressure finally drops below the point of consciousness. An armored spearhead can outpace enemy defenses. It can also outpace its own stomach. Picture the road in early spring. Cold air, wet shoulders, vehicles packed close. Ahead, tanks and half-tracks. In the middle, the command and reconnaissance. Behind them, the quiet machinery of sustenance. Fuel trucks, ammo, maintenance, bridging equipment. Spread out, regulated by military police and circumstance. A convoy like that does not behave like a line. It behaves like a fluid in a pipe. If the pipe narrows, pressure rises, a few vehicles break, the next few compress. Soon, the entire column becomes a long, breathing jam. Engines idle. Consumption continues. Every minute costs fuel, even when you are motionless. This is where the arithmetic begins to matter more than courage. A tank does not have to be destroyed to be neutralized. It only has to be immobilized. Rose's plan demanded tempo. Tempo demanded fuel. Fuel demanded that the trucks behind him reach the right place at the right time. The road he selected, his one road, was not just a route forward. It was the only artery through which fuel could travel to him. And now, that artery began to clot. In a perfect system, refueling is a rotating cycle. Elements push forward, another element catches up. Fuel is passed, the column continues. But in reality, refuel operations are vulnerable to tiny disruptions. A bridge with a weight limit, a sharp bend where vehicles slow, a village intersection with rubble, a checkpoint that insists on spacing, a disabled truck that can't be bypassed because the shoulder is mud, a detour that forces everything through a narrower path. The entire Allied way of war was built on solving this problem at scale. The U.S. Army had learned in France that you could win a battle and still lose days to supply. That is why the logistics machine behind the front was as important as the front itself. Roads were managed, traffic was policed, routes were assigned, fuel dumps were staged, but even the best system depends on timing. And timing is fragile when everything depends on one road. The title of this episode claims 14 minutes later his fuel was 0. Take that number as a narrative measure of how quickly a decision can become irreversible once the system breaks. A spearhead can move from tight but workable to dead in the road faster than a commander can rewrite his plan, because the real limits are mechanical and cumulative. Fuel is spent continuously. Momentum is not. Rose likely did what aggressive commanders always do when they sense friction. He pressed harder. He would have urged the lead elements forward, trying to burst through whatever resistance lay ahead. That's rational from a tactical viewpoint. If you reach your objective, if you break the enemy's line, you can seize crossings, capture depots, force surrenders. But logistics doesn't care about what feels bold. Logistics only cares about distance, time, and flow. As the lead elements advanced, the fuel trucks behind them were not merely following. They were fighting their own battle against congestion, against road discipline, against the physical limits of traffic. In armored warfare, the fuel echelon lives in a strange world. It is essential, yet always at risk. It must move close enough to supply, but far enough to survive. It must be fast, but cannot be fast when it is stuck behind everyone else. If you want to understand how an armored division can be stopped without being defeated, follow the fuel. Every vehicle has a consumption profile. Tanks drink more than trucks. Half-tracks sit in between. Idling is not free. Start-stop movement is expensive. Detours multiply costs. Drivers keep engines running because restarting under pressure is a risk. Engines must stay warm. Radios must stay powered. A column that waits burns fuel while doing nothing. Now add the single most dangerous feature of a jam: the inability to reorder. Once vehicles are in a tight column, you cannot easily move the fuel trucks forward. You cannot leapfrog tankers to the front without a controlled passing lane, and if you try to break order, you create chaos. Vehicles turning around, blocking intersections, mixing units, confusing commanders, so the front begins to starve while fuel sits somewhere behind it, trapped by the same road the spearhead depends on. This is how an army gets beaten by geometry. At this point, Rose's battlefield is no longer the hedgerows, towns, or ridgelines in front of him. His battlefield is the traffic pattern behind him. His enemy is not a German unit. His enemy is a bottleneck. In the systems beat humans lens, this is the moment where war becomes a spreadsheet problem. How many gallons are still in the lead companies? How far to the next planned refuel? How long until the fuel echelon arrives, if it arrives? How long can the division maintain forward movement before it becomes an inert mass? A commander can fight a tank. He can't fight an equation whose variables are already fixed. Rose's plan assumed continuity. The hidden variable broke continuity. And the consequence is always the same. The spearhead turns into a parking lot of high-value targets. Even if the enemy does not exploit it, the pause itself is devastating, because the longer you stop, the harder it is to start again. Engines overheat in slow movement, tracks wear, crew fatigue climbs, coordination decays, security becomes harder. A moving armored formation is difficult to hit. A stationary one is a set of somewhere on that road. You can imagine the human experience of the system failing. Tank commanders listening to radios for refuel instructions that don't come. Drivers climbing out to check their fuel gauges. The quiet panic of a machine force discovering that its mobility was never truly its own. It was leased from a supply system, and the supply system was late. This is not a romantic moment. It is administrative. It is mechanical. It is humiliating. It's the kind of failure that doesn't produce a heroic last stand. It produces stalled engines, improvised siphoning, and commanders doing math in their heads while pretending they aren't scared. Rose was known as an aggressive leader, but he was also a professional. He would have understood exactly what fuel starvation means, not just inability to advance, but inability to react. If the enemy appears on a flank, you cannot shift. If a bridge is threatened, you cannot rush engineers forward. If a gap opens, you cannot exploit it. You become predictable. You become slow. You become an easy opponent. A mechanized force deprived of fuel becomes infantry with very heavy backpacks. And that is the measurable outcome, the collapse of operational tempo into immobility. Now zoom out and look at why this is so lethal. The US Army's advantage in 1945 was not simply that it had more vehicles. It was that it had built a system that could keep those vehicles moving across a continent. The Germans, increasingly, could not. Their shortages forced them into reactive movement, reduced training, fewer reserves, fewer repair options. Their big cats were terrifying tactically, but vulnerable logistically. The Allies built an approach where the front is an extension of the rear, where replacements, fuel, and ammunition arrive in a steady stream, where breakdowns are solved by recovery and repair rather than abandonment, where a stalled advance can be restarted because the system behind it is deep and redundant. Rose's road gamble shows the inverse truth. Even the side with the stronger system can suffer a local system failure, and when it does, the front becomes mortal. In other words, you can have the largest factory in the world and still lose a day because of one bridge, one intersection, one blocked lane, one missequenced convoy. That's why this kind of story matters. It's not a tale of heroics. It's a demonstration of how modern war, and it's why commanders obsess over routes. To keep retention, here is the uncomfortable detail. This failure can happen without any enemy action. The enemy can be passive, and you can still immobilize yourself through congestion. Friction isn't always hostile. Sometimes it is purely physical. Consider a bridge with a load limit. Tanks may cross one by one. Trucks may cross in groups. Engineers may need to reinforce. If the plan relies on rapid crossing and the bridge enforces a slower cadence, your timeline shatters. Now vehicles accumulate on both sides. The road becomes a compression chamber. The fuel echelon cannot reach forward because the crossing schedule prioritizes combat vehicles. That feels logical. Let the tanks go first. But if tanks go first without fuel, you have only moved the problem forward. You have created distance between the spearhead and its supply. A combat-first traffic rule can produce a support-late collapse. Or picture a narrow town street. A single disabled truck blocks it. To tow it, you need a recovery vehicle. That recovery vehicle is behind the traffic jam. You can't get the wrecker forward because the road is full, so you are trapped in it. The system waits for the tool that is trapped inside the system. This is why in the final year of the war, armies that could rapidly clear blockages had an advantage beyond firepower. They were faster not because they drove faster, but because they recovered faster. In Rose's scenario, a single road means no bypass. When the pipe clogs, there is no alternate path. You cannot reroute thousands of vehicles instantly. You cannot just take another road. If the secondary roads cannot support the tonnage, or if they are mined, or if they pass through bridges that can't carry armor, or if they turn into mud, the map offers options, the ground often does not. That is the difference between planning and reality. And that difference is where the catastrophe lives. Now, what would the 14 minutes feel like? Not like a movie chase, more like a clock running out in slow motion. A commander watching the fuel situation deteriorate faster than any tactical adjustment can compensate. Messages coming in: fuel low in lead company, fuel truck delayed, road blocked, detour uncertain, another unit requesting priority passage, another report of a stalled vehicle, another call for resupply that cannot be answered. Each message is a microhook. Each message is another variable closing. Rose likely realized, as any experienced commander would, that once fuel levels fall below a certain threshold, you cannot keep pushing. You must preserve what mobility remains. That means consolidating, securing, and waiting. But waiting is exactly what the operational gamble forbids, because the gamble is based on time. If you stop, the enemy reorganizes. If you stop, you lose surprise. If you stop, your one road becomes predictable and contested. So the decision is brutal in its simplicity. Keep going and risk total immobilization, or stop and accept the loss of momentum. This is where leadership feels like agency, but the system determines the outcome. Courage becomes a variable, and the system is indifferent to courage. If Rose stopped, he could try to pull back to a more defensible posture, perhaps closer to fuel. But pulling back also consumes fuel. Moving any distance consumes what you are short of. In a fuel crisis, even retreat can become impossible. If he pushed forward, he risked reaching a position where he could neither advance nor reverse. A spearhead can turn into a trapped wedge. This is not theory. Armored history is full of moments where momentum outran supply and created vulnerability. Sometimes the enemy exploited it. Sometimes the weather did. Sometimes the road network did. But the pattern is consistent. At a certain point, the combat story becomes secondary. The real story becomes, can the system restore flow before the front becomes inert? That's what makes these stories feel modern. They resemble failures in any large machine. A factory line halted by missing parts, a shipping network stalled by a port backlog, a city gridlocked by one broken interchange. The scale is different. The logic is the same. The machine was hungry is not a metaphor here. A mechanized division consumes fuel as a biological necessity. Feed it, and it moves. Starve it, and it becomes a steel museum. Now a careful historical note. Major General Maurice Rose is a real figure and a renowned U.S. armored commander. He was killed in action near Paderborn in late March 1945. Some modern accounts discuss fast task forces and supply strain in the closing drive into Germany, but the exact 14 minutes to zero fuel phrasing is a narrative framing not a universally standardized historical metric. What is historically plausible and repeatedly documented across late war operations is that rapid armored thrusts were frequently constrained by fuel delivery timing and road congestion, especially when everyone used the same routes and bridges. When we compress that system failure into 14 minutes, we're highlighting the speed at which a plan collapses once a supply timer expires. And that is the value of the story. It's a demonstration, not a myth. Because if you want to build a channel like this, you don't just tell what happened. You explain why it was inevitable once the variables were set. Rose's choice of one road wasn't foolish. It was an attempt to control complexity. Multiple routes create dispersion. Dispersion creates coordination problems. One road keeps the division unified. It keeps command simple. It keeps the spearhead tight. But simplicity has a price. It creates a single point of failure, so the road becomes more than geography. It becomes destiny. As the fuel timer ran down, his staff would have done what staff officers do. They would attempt to reroute fuel, to prioritize, to cut through the jam. Military police would try to reverse vehicles, create passing lanes, clear intersections. Engineers would work to repair or expand crossing points. Drivers would be ordered to close gaps and keep moving. People would sprint messages forward, because radios are not always reliable in congested columns. Those actions are the human layer trying to rescue the system, and sometimes it works. But the rescue has its own clock. Every solution takes time. Time burns fuel, so the rescue effort is always behind. That is why system failures in war feel like drowning. You are working hard and still losing ground. If the fuel echelon arrives, the spearhead can be revived, but the revival is not instantaneous. Refueling takes time. Vehicles must rotate. Security must be maintained. The road must remain clear, and by then, the opportunity that justified the gamble may be gone. This is the final cruelty of logistics. It doesn't just stop you, it changes what is possible. Even if Rose's division eventually received fuel, the one-road dash had already been transformed into a slower, more methodical advance. The enemy would have more time to form ad hoc defenses, to place anti-tank guns, to coordinate counterattacks, to mine likely approaches. The advantage of surprise would shrink. The cost of progress would rise. In that sense, fuel starvation is not a pause. It is a rewrite of reality. And that is the measurable catastrophe. A fast operation becomes a slow one. A surgical thrust becomes grinding movement. A plan designed for minutes is forced into hours. Now zoom out one more time for the verdict. People love stories where generals outthink other generals, where daring maneuvers win the day. But in the late mechanized war, especially on the Western Front, outcomes increasingly depended on throughput and timing. How quickly supplies could be converted into motion, and how reliably that motion could be maintained. This wasn't a duel, it was a processing system. Rose's gamble illustrates the larger rule that modern armies learn the hard way. If your advance depends on a single artery, you are not advancing, you are betting that artery won't fail. And in war, arteries fail. They fail because of traffic. They fail because of bridges. They fail because of breakdowns. They fail because a plan assumed clean flow in a world designed to produce friction. In the mythology of armored warfare, tanks are kings. In the reality, fuel trucks are the crown. Major General Rose was a commander who understood speed, aggression, and the psychology of momentum. But momentum itself was not purely a matter of will. It was the product of a supply machine that had to deliver at the exact pace that the front consumed. When that machine slipped, when the road clogged, when the schedule drifted, when the refuel rhythm broke, the spearhead did not lose a battle. It lost a property, mobility. And when mobility disappears, every other advantage becomes a statistic. If you take one lesson from this story, let it be this. The most dangerous enemy in mechanized war is not always the man across the line. Sometimes it's the silent mathematics behind you: miles per gallon, vehicles per hour, bridges per ton, and minutes per decision. Where are you watching from? And what hidden variable should we cover next?